When I choreographed this work called Cicada Images Molting, the opening image is of me in a cage, and first line was, "Who am I?" And what Alice in Wonderland said to, the caterpillar said to Alice, "Who are you?" So throughout my entire pathway of being an artist and a choreographer, who are you? Who am I? What does it mean to be Chinese? What does it mean to be Chinese American? How do you straddle multiple identities and braid that and synthesize that into a contemporary living choreographer and movement artist? And very interestingly, very recently, I was packing my boxes to finish sending the last of my books to the National Taipei University of the Arts, to the Lu Wong collection. And these books weren't sent 5 years ago because I had planned to write many articles about the nature of cultural identity and the official representation of that cultural identity, and how that image impinge on our own self-worth, our individually and collectively as a nation. So when I opened the boxes from my garage, knowing that these boxes containing a very important research topic as well as for me choreographic inspirations and sources, I wanted to examine the impact of the Cultural Revolution and the impact of the dance works that were created during that period, and of course the periods before that. So I'm going to come and first talk about, as a child born in Kunming, Yunnan, my first images were, and sounds were, of the indigenous people, because song, dance, drumming, music were always part of everyday life. And it certainly must be present during any festivities, rituals, celebrations, birthdays, rites of passage. And as I mentioned before, I think I heard them even when I was in my mother's womb. So for me, the earliest recollection as an embryo, if you must, were of the drumming and the singing of the Miao people and the indigenous peoples of that era. And when we moved so many times to Shanghai, to Guangzhou, and finally to Hong Kong, I was 10 then, and Hong Kong being a British colony, all our textbooks were in English. And because the British textbook for its colonies were very different from British textbooks in London, for example. So as a colonial resident, we studied about other peoples like Rama of Egypt, and then Gregory from Lancaster, and then there's Fong from China, buck teeth, yellow, and we looked at this image of ourselves, and we not only felt ashamed and felt misunderstood because we are not yellow. We don't see ourselves as, egg yolk yellow. To us, we're the normal color, and we call the other people white people. So it was a the whole class felt a sense of great shame to see ourselves represented in that textbook. And the sense of shame and being a third-rate citizen was daily reinforced being in a British colonial system where, we ran out and cheered the Queen, and we didn't know who we're supposed to pledge allegiance. Is it to Mao Zedong? Is it to Jiang Jieshi? Or to the Queen? So the confusion of being a colonized people was not articulated. I was too young. I didn't know how to articulate it except to feel quite constantly self-conscious and quite constantly inferior and ashamed. And this sense of inferiority then permeated my early training in ballet. Ballet was looked upon as a very upper-class activity because only wealthy people could afford to send their children for classes. And it was totally done by white Russians who came from Russia through Shanghai, like my teacher, Carol Bateman, or from British graduates of the Royal Academy. And we had our classes in the Helena May residence for women, and that was the only place where the rooms are big. It's in the dining area, and there's a stage. And my earliest identity was with Dance of the Little Swans from Swan Lake. And when I was taught a small portion of this, it truly, absolutely affirmed me, my identity, my value. And of course, part of the ballet training is one day you will go on point. And this particular process, I have likened it to wrapping to Chinese feet binding, 包小脚, because part of the nature of point or to be on one's tiptoe is you actually force the feet to, if you look at ballerinas, you take off their shoes, the feet are deformed. So in a way, it is like foot binding. But what is not taught by my teacher was that you cannot go on point until physically you are able to support yourself to not only to relevate, to go into your second joint. And then when you are strong enough, your core muscles are strong enough, then you can go on tiptoe. But because we were never properly trained, we all went on point, and of course our feet were really devastated. We have blisters every day, and then the worst part is the point shoes were ordered 3 months ahead of time to be sent later. So the notion of ballet was, 1, wealthy people do ballet. 2, ballet fulfilled this fantasy of the fragile female, the 19th century romanticism of being supported by male, and of course, and of course, a certain aesthetic. Those are the qualities to emulate. Soft, light, fragile, and more than anything else, ethereal, like whether it's Giselle. And the Western ballet story, the women seldom get fulfillment. It's only when they died. Like Giselle, she had to come back as a ghost. And Swan Lake was cursed. The swan was cursed, and then she was betrayed by her prince. So it was, for me, not very positive role image. When we left China, Guangzhou, to Hong Kong in 1949, we had European ballet performances every now and then, but we really didn't have any exposure to what it meant to have Chinese dances or Chinese cultural activities, because there were no diplomatic relations between China and Great Britain. Then in 1957, the East is Red ensemble, which is a song and dance ensemble, came to Hong Kong to perform. And for me, millions of Chinese in Hong Kong, we were moved by the beauty of the ensemble, the choreographic and entertainment value. It made such a great impact for me to see Chinese dancing, to see Chinese women and Chinese men dancing, and not dancing as part of Jingzhi or a theatrical enclave, but dancing as dance. And in the repertoire, there were folk dances from the Han people, but for the first time I also saw dances from so-called indigenous people. In those days, they were termed minority peoples, like Xinjiang, Tibet, Southwest China, the places that I knew as a very young girl in Yunnan. And that made a really strong impact on me, and a very positive impact. So on one hand, the impact of ballet was, you're not quite right. On the other hand, the impact of these performances of indigenous people, of the Han people, reaffirm my identity as a Chinese, because at that time I just have a blank. I have no images of what it meant to be correctly Chinese. And as time went on, China, specifically Guangzhou and Hong Kong, had more and more relationship. The commerce certainly is one of them, and people could start to go back and forth with more freedom than before. And we would have films and sometimes live performances coming out of China, and they were always very positive and something we as a family even look forward to see. So I'm going to jump and skip my days with Graham and her challenge to me to find the footsteps of my own ancestors. That has been covered in other parts of my oral history. But I want to say that after Nixon established his Pingpong Diplomacy and opened for the first time since 1949 the possibility of exchange, and as with all such early stages of diplomacy, the exchange very often used the more acceptable and less politically charged dimension, that of either a dance or music. Not so drama, because it has spoken words, and the minute you have spoken words, you will have ideology. So I would, together with Zhou Wenzhong, a composer from Columbia University, the two of us were invited through the commission to United Nations, through the members and the staff. I was contacted and said, you have been invited and selected. Would you like to go? And I said, yes. So I had to go to Canada to get my entry permit, and it was really very tense because we were told you cannot bring any clothing with flowers, and then no high heel shoes, all of those things. And we tried to look as much like the people in China as possible, but it's not possible. So we stand out as a foreigner. And my trip was arranged through the UN, and I was met by high officials. And I first landed in Beijing, and I was met by Madame Xie Bingxing. So all the itinerary was arranged. I would give the first day what I was to do at my hotel. And the hotel was practically empty. I was maybe the third guest. And so you go through the lobby, knew exactly who you were. You were being escorted to the third floor. You never carry your own key. They have the key, and then you are shown into your room. And every morning you will be told at such and such a time, come down for breakfast, and then the itinerary for the day. So my first opportunity to see dance was at the National Institute of Chinese Minorities, 中央民族学院. I think this was chosen because the nationalities is a not so sensitive political arena, unlike the ballet school or the Central Performing Arts Academy, because of the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution. And at this school, I was the only one. There were demonstrations by the faculty and students of so-called Han Chinese dances, which were either choreographed by Madame Dai Lian or folk dances that were mosaicized to become performances rather than part of festivals and harvest or rites of passages. And that lasted about 4 days, and then every evening we have a seminar, and it was very, very tense. I think on my part, I didn't certainly want to be very careful not to say anything wrong, and certainly not to say anything wrong to cause problem, but not to say anything wrong that I can be detained. And they were very, very nervous because they want to be sure and say the party line, and at that time the party line was unclear. So as I said, the comrades would light a cigarette and then we will watch the smoke, and then we'll change the subject, and then they said the official line, and I, of course, kept nodding and agreeing, and then they would light another cigarette and they would change to another official line. And I sat there inhaling secondhand smoke. But fortunately, even though this went on every afternoon and evening, I was permitted to see many choreographic works, like the most important was the White Hair Girl. So from 1974 onwards to 1994, I have gone back to China maybe more than 12 times, some at the invitation of the Ministry of Education the arts education, others through the Asian Council, which is funded by the Rockefeller Fund, to create teaching materials, to help choreography, and to introduce, quote, contemporary and modern approaches from the West. In 1984, a very big milestone was the invitation for me to establish Laba movement analysis for the 3 national academies of dance, the Beijing Academy, the Shanghai Academy, and the Guangdong Academy. So I'm going to skip to another 10 years. In 1994, I was in Shanghai at a little coffee shop outside of the Shanghai Dance Academy. In China, the official policy is, of course, the 3 major institutions supported by the central government is just top. And then you have regional places in different provinces, but they lack prestige or funding. And the policy in these top institutions is every year they're allowed to retain 2 graduates. And they call these graduates those who have graduated, but the institution invite them to stay behind. This carries tremendous prestige because, one, that means you are the 2 among hordes. Second, it means you would have a place to live because they provide you with housing. And then the third is your 户口, which is your identity, your identification card, will be in Beijing or Shanghai, which meant your food rations will be better than any place in the whole country. So it's like a gold rice bowl. So in 1994, we were at a coffee shop next to Shanghai, and this young professor who was retained by the institutions, which meant he has certain accomplishment. We were talking, and he, in a manner almost close to choking, and it was very difficult for him to say it. He said, Wang Lao Shi, Professor Wang, what we have as our national dance, the images of us in dance internationally, is like a fetus that has become deformed. It's like a deformed fetus. And when he blurted that out, I knew it took him a great deal of courage. And it's something that's been bothering him for a long time, but he couldn't find anyone to say these words. And I knew exactly what he meant. It's a very, very bizarre scene. But we have tears in our eyes, and I nodded and I said, I hear you. And at that moment, I knew he could never say it. He would lose his job. He's got to follow whatever the context is, right? He needs the job. This is his training. These are his teachers. And since then, I've always talked about how to be a good ancestor. What is my role as being what Jonas Salk talks about? We don't just, evolution is not just evolving from all these things to mammals and to human beings. Evolution is also forward-looking. How do we want to evolve towards something? And that, for me, is central. And at that moment in 1994, I thought, well, he can't talk. I am an elder, and I have been outside and I have a global view, then my duty and my job is to find a way to address this aborted and bizarre fetus. So why do we say that? If we have amnesia, every colonial culture after liberation, the first thing they want is to say, who are we? What has been wiped out? What has been bleached out? We want that which belonged to us. We want them back. We want to be able to speak our own language. We want to be able to dress. We want to follow our own religion, and we want to be affirmed in this identity. Because if we look at the evolutionary changes in China, it's so very much tied to the political ideology. So in ballet, so much of Chinese post-1949 cultural expression were influenced by the Soviet Union. So let's go look at Soviet Union. Ballet was imported during Peter the Great from France. It was not indigenous to Russia. And it was entirely a court activity. Only the nobility could sit and watch the dancers from Paris perform. So it is very much divorced from the Russian peasants or the Russian expression. Yet, after the Bolsheviks overthrew the czars and they were, dethroned and murdered and so forth, the very thing that they revolted against may be institutionalized in the political system and the education system, but in the cultural realm, they retained the remnants of the Parisian nobility. And yes, they have choreographed dances and productions that reflect the new Russia, but the staple was Giselle, Swan Lake. What are they? They're 19th century romantic ballet. And they became the staple. So in 1949, when the Chinese People's Republic of China was established, unfortunately, the US did not extend a friendly hand. So for the new China, the only friend was Soviet Union. And the framework of Soviet culture was French import ballet. And that the Soviet Union did not examine. Hey, this is bourgeoisie, this is aristocratic. Why are you putting, you had a revolution, but you are bringing back 19th and 18th century icons. And I know this from my friend Jiang Qing, who is a movie star and was trained in China from early 1949. She was trained in the Beijing Academy. And she was at the point where the Soviet teachers were trying to analyze how to, quote, do a scientific vocabulary for Chinese, to make a Chinese syllabus, to create a core. So they said, okay, in ballet we have first position, fifth position, second position, fourth position. So why don't we then do the Chinese, because your eyes are this way. So instead of this way, we went that way. So that's verse 2nd, 4th, 5th. And that, instead of turnout, first position, second position, third, fourth, fifth, they do parallel. So that became the curriculum and the vocabulary of whether it's Chinese folk dance or whether it's Chinese, quote, classical dance. They became the opposite of a Western European pedagogy and put on a Chinese framework. And according to Jiang Qing, this was the standard curriculum. So this is a 6-year curriculum of this. If you look at traditional movement, whether it's martial arts, we don't have annotations of different folk dances from regions. This collection really happened after 1949. But we don't have a codified vocabulary about this is first position, second. There isn't. In fact, if there's anything, it's the fluidity of the movement and the fluidity of qi that does not allow you to arrest it into these fixed positions. So that's one of the first codification that no one ever examined and say, wait a minute, there's no reason to take a Western standard and then force our movement to fit into that criteria of first, second, third, fourth, fifth. And the second thing that our Chinese early government and the Cultural Ministry of Culture and all the cultural workers, we call, was to follow the lead of Soviet Union in terms of repertory. If you look at early ballet, we did Swan Lake as well as Giselle, the classic standard 19th century large-scale ballet. And we then institutionalized people sitting in the audience and looking at a proscenium stage. So that is very clear, and it's backed by historical facts. From 1949 to for the next 20 years, very much the development of dance and dance ethnography were greatly modeled, I would say primarily modeled after the Soviet Union. And we had Moiseyev style spectacles of men leaping and doing the Cossack dance put on top of dances that have to do with agriculture. We don't have this vast plain where the horses are riding. Yeah, a small percentage, but this is an agricultural culture, and the dances from Shandong and the movement of the shoulders and the use of basic martial arts discipline, which they all are part of Chinese culture, but you don't see it manifest on the stage. But we saw this very standardized, but nevertheless almost showman-like, like how high the men could leap and touch their toes, or leap over 6 people, or girls who spin, or girls who can bend backward and have their head come through their 2 legs. So that it took on dimensions of acrobatic show, circus show, and of which the main goal is to entertain, and it doesn't matter if it's authentic or whether it is based on research. And this period, no foreign films were allowed in. Even the domestic films were films of these dancers. So you can see how desperate an average citizen is to just see something, because on the radio it's the same official line, and movies are the same, and at least when it's a live performance, you get the richness of music and true live people performing. And because everything is then centralized and channeled with no leeway for creation of new works except the party line, then when Jiang Qing and her group started the Cultural Revolution, they understood, because in 1942, when Mao Zedong said at the Yan'an Forum, what is art and literature? What is the forum of art and literature? In that forum, he defined that art and literature is to serve the people. So for no other, this is the primary reason. And therefore, the policy and the expression followed this. But who are the people and how do you serve them? This was this underlie cultural policy, of course. But when Jiang Qing was able to assume power, she saw the need to create new icons, new heroes, new heroines. And she, with her committee, there are just hundreds of people working in every large city, from hours of examining and endeavor to create a new iconic man and a male and female. So the Red Detachment of Women was the signature work that was created. And in that, the heroine, of course, no longer wear 19th century costumes of the Romantic era. She's wearing the top and trousers of most peasant girl, and she had a long braid which showed her peasant background. And then the male character is the revolutionary underground leader, and they're of course fighting against the oppression of the landlord. And also she also joined the fight against the Japanese. So the choreography took elements of 19th century ballet, story ballets. They took elements from Jingju, Chinese theater, traditional theater, Chinese opera. And then the heroine still wore, the heroine was created with military uniform and Bermuda shorts, you know, this length, knee socks, and then she still, the shoes were point shoes. And in addition to any of the arabesque, the heroine and all the female Red Detachment women had rifles. And they wore a Mao-style cap. And the choreography, basically, if you're carrying rifles, you can't move very much. And so their group with jetés and chapés and basic ballet steps, but with additional Jingju, Chinese opera added, especially in the fight and leaps. And according to Zhang Qing, she wanted to create a new heroine, and this new heroine stands taller than anybody. That's why she is on tiptoes. So I think on paper it sounds heroic, but have you ever tried to touch somebody on tiptoe? They fall over. There's absolutely no stability with anybody on tiptoe, because it's the law of physics is that you will fall. If you're on your flat feet, you won't fall. So she also said she wanted the women on point, because the women stood up and will be taller than anybody. I think therein lies the seed of this bizarre and aborted fetus. Something is genetically warped if you perceive standing on point as being strong and rise up, you slaves, then you are actually totally negating the instability of standing on point. And if physiologically you cannot do it, you are false. You are lying. And if there's one thing Graham said, is the body does not lie. So you cannot stand on point and be strong, because you will fall down. And I would say on one level, this strained fetus is the denial or contradictory manifestation of what the human body, the law of physics, and the need to bend that to an ideological framework. Another aspect of this aborted and bizarre fetus, well, a fetus comes alive with the gene from a mother and a gene from a father, and those genetic heritage give the fetus the shape of his head, his intelligence, his personality, all the things that go to form this individual. The strange aborted fetus got some of his skeletal makeup from the structure of ballet, got some of the makeup from some aspects of what we call national or folk dancing. And then it got very, very little dimension of a very important genetic component for all Chinese, and that is martial arts. Where do you see in all of this the principles of martial art? I'm not talking about whether you make a fist or whether you can do some somersaults. I'm talking about the basic interaction of the energy of yin and yang. And this is our genetic makeup. Hundreds of years. Where did that go? You don't see that. And therefore, the fetus is confused. It put on this bizarre external manifestations. It has to point its toes, whereas in Chinese martial arts, because it was based on survival. Have you ever tried to kick someone with your feet pointed? No. You have your foot broken just like that. So the force of kicking is central to any kind of combat, right? This is how we survive. So this poor fetus were given really, really poor genetic makeup, bizarre genetic makeup, poor nutrition because it was force-fed stuff that's not native to it, to the diet, and then were also lethal in that instead of being able to evolve and absorb and create new forms, it got stuck into a political correctness where nobody could make any move without the approval of all the different interests. And therefore, it's a stunted and malnourished fetus in addition to be a bizarre one. It can't possibly flourish. And the challenge for me is not just negating it. I have no way to accept this. But other people have because they don't know. They don't know the rich cultural tradition. People who are in this system cannot afford to criticize it because early on I said, you know, those students who are first rate perpetuate the party line. So they cannot afford to, and nor do they have the liberty and the freedom to create something that is not in that mode. They would lose their residency, they would lose their job, and in that kind of political and economic system, they are asking for, well, they're asking for their whole livelihood. So there's no way for any challenge. While I'm not saying, what I want to do today is just to give another perspective and to say why in 1994 both of us wept. He wept because of his own future. He's not going to leave China. I wept because I saw something so frighteningly awful and such a betrayal of my own cultural heritage and the resolve to say something about it. I don't mean that I can solve all of that, and I don't want to. I'm not responsible for any official. I'm just an artist who care deeply about my cultural heritages. I'm not just only one, but the world heritage. And I'm an artist who can articulate clearly what went wrong, and perhaps it's not within my reach and my power to correct it. For, I don't have that means, but I can point out, I can guide, and this whole recording, because I know I won't have time and energy to write, this whole recording would be a first step in a legacy that should there be young students or teachers or cultural workers who want to hear a different perspective, this will be archived at National Taipei University of the Arts and archived at the Lincoln Center. So I know, just like anything on Google, Facebook, and YouTube, I just want to put it out there, and hopefully someday somebody will click on and say, wow, she makes a lot of sense. That might be a way I can find my way to my own cultural heritage, to my identity, and to my artistic creation. That, to me, would be one small fraction of what, as an ancestor, I could do and did do, maybe, to plant the seed.